This is a special lecture on the case Bush versus Gore. The reason why I'm doing this for you is because the case facts of this particular case are so convoluted that I thought a rundown of them in chronological order might be really helpful. And I'll also include some information about the decision of the court in this case. So let's look at the timeline for Bush versus Gore. Of course, we know this involves the 2000 election between Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush and Democratic presidential candidate Albert Gore. On the day of the election, November 7th at 8 p.m., most of the media calls Florida for Gore based on exit polls. And the time that they did this, at the time that they did this, polls were still open in the Panhandle, which is a real no-no. In fact, most media won't do this until all the polls have closed in a state, to call a state before some people had a chance to cast their vote. Also, there's this sort of juggling that goes on where at 9:30, at 8 o'clock, after calling it Florida for Gore, at 9:30 all of a sudden there's uncertainty, and then by 10 o'clock CBS News retracts it's this, calling Florida for Gore, and says it's too close to call. Then at 2:15 they call Florida for Bush, and then Gore actually calls Bush to concede. And then later they retract again and say, no, it's too close to call. Things are not very clear about what's going on in Florida. And so Gore calls Bush back and says, I'm retracting my concession. It was really political theater. It was just so much uncertainty. Why was Florida important? Well, it was clear that Florida was a battleground state, and that whoever won that state was going to win the presidency. And so it just seemed like it was a perfect storm of Florida being the important state, also Florida being too close to call for one candidate or the other in their projections, the media's projections, and then this disastrous mechanism for counting votes, which we'll get into in a minute. Okay, so on the 8th, it's announced that Bush is leading Gore in the state of Florida by 1,784 votes out of almost 6 million cast. Under state law, this triggers an automatic machine recount, which means that they take all 5,816,486 ballots and run them through the machines again. Now, we're talking here, actually, it probably wasn't all of those ballots, but because they were using different mechanisms. But in many counties, they were still using punch cards, computer cards that you would put into a slot, and it would tell you, punch out this hole if you want to cast a vote for this candidate. And they reran all of those ballots through a machine. The problem is actually that running them through a machine again doesn't solve some problems. In particular, it doesn't solve the problems of Chads being forced by the machine back up into the slot from which they had been punched out, and thus registering a non-vote. So as a result, on the 9th, so 2 days after the election, Gore requests hand recounts, but he only makes this request for 4 mostly Democratic counties. Now, he's allowed to do that under state law, but it is a huge mistake on his part, because those counties were going to be counted for Gore anyway, and there were other problems in other counties that were cropping up that never got addressed, or that Al Gore never asked to be addressed. Then on the 14th, the Secretary of State for the state of Florida, who was a Republican, certifies the returns, and at that point, the state Supreme Court delays the certification until the 26th of the month to allow the inclusion of these hand recounts that Al Gore had requested. On the 26th, on the date that the state Supreme Court set, George Bush is still winning, but he's winning by 537 votes. And at that point, Gore files a lawsuit in Florida courts. Bush files a lawsuit in federal court, district court in the state of Florida. So we've got a state lawsuit and a federal lawsuit, and Bush files to stop the state Supreme Court from delaying certification again. And on the 1st of December, the Supreme Court hears oral argument over the selective manual recounts that Al Gore had requested. And this brings up the whole hanging Chad issue. If you really want to know something about how these hanging Chads influenced the outcome of the election in Florida in 2000, you should watch an HBO special, HBO movie called Recount, and it shows graphically how the Chad can be forced up into the machine, literally by simply feeding the card into the machine like you would feed a credit card into an ATM machine. There's a little device that grabs the card and pulls it in. In the case of recounting these ballots, that device would force the Chad back up into the hole that it had been punched out of. On the 4th of December, the Supreme Court orders the Florida Supreme Court to clarify the basis of its decision, to make clear to the court what standard it is using to order the recount and how the recount should be conducted. The Florida Supreme Court articulates a standard for evaluating those ballots in which no vote for president was recorded, and they say the standard is intent of the voter. The Supreme Court hears oral arguments in Bush versus Gore, and in that case, Bush argues that the intent of the voter standard is too vague, will allow similar cards to be counted differently based on how people in different counties and different precincts interpret the intent of the voter standard, and thus that raises an equal protection claim in the case. So on the 12th, we have a safe harbor deadline. This is by a Federal Electoral Count Act of 1887. This safe harbor deadline simply means that if an election dispute remains pending, the state's electoral votes can be challenged in Congress. This was an effort to bring an election to an end and not allow a single state to hold up its results. At 10 o'clock on the same day, Bush versus Gore is handed down. The safe harbor deadline is actually an hour and 57 minutes later, I believe. And Bush versus Gore is handed down at 10 o'clock, and Gore concedes, holds his press conference, and on the 18th, members of the Electoral College meet, and they cast their for Florida, meet with the Electoral College, and they cast their votes for Bush. On the 6th, Congress meets in joint session to tally the results, and according to the Constitution, the Vice President of the United States is the one who counts the results and certifies them and announces who has won the election, and that Vice President at the time, of course, was Al Gore. He had the dubious honor of declaring George Bush the victor in the election, and as I say here, it brings to mind something about ironic. Okay, so what were the legal issues raised in this case? Well, first of all, Article 2 says that each state has responsibility for determining the manner of the appointment of electors to the Electoral College, and also there's a question of whether the Florida Supreme Court was actually delaying and not respecting the intent of the safe harbor deadline, and was actually misinterpreting its own state election law in a way that would push the Florida results past the safe harbor deadline. There was a due process question raised, and it was raised by the Bush camp, but it drops out of the court's opinion. Instead, they interpret this in terms of Article 2 and also equal protection, and making the decision that similarly punched cards, or in this case not punched, are counted differently because the intent of the voter standard is too vague. The per curiam opinion identified this equal protection problem. They said the goal of the Florida law was to meet the safe harbor deadline, and the state Supreme Court had delayed the certification of the results for so long that there was no remedy possible. It was the deadline was an hour and 59 minutes after the Bush versus Gore decision was handed down, and 7 justices here, they identify this equal protection problem, and they also say that no remedy is possible. There was some disagreement about how much time should remain to fix the problem, and whether the safe harbor deadline was really all that precise. We get 5 justices signing on to the safe harbor concern, and we get 7 justices signing on to the equal protection concern. And you'll notice that Justice Breyer signed on to the equal protection, to identifying an equal protection problem, but we'll discuss his point of view in a little bit. Okay, the dissenters were Stevens and Ginsburg, and they said that there really was no equal protection problem, that the intent of the voter standard was clear enough, and that the Supreme Court, by deciding this case, was showing a lack of respect for the Florida court's role in determining its own election laws. Also, as we said about Breyer, that he believed there was an equal protection problem, but he also wrote this: "The court is wrong to take this case. It was wrong to grant a stay. It should now vacate that stay and permit the Florida Supreme Court to decide whether the recount should resume." Okay, so that's sort of a rundown of the Bush versus Gore case, and I hope that was helpful in figuring out exactly what that case was about, what sorts of problems it presented.